Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. The night settles quietly over the silent empires, where power shifts in whispers and loyalties are tested in the dark. Tonight, we focus on John Stanfa, a man who navigated the stormy world of Philadelphia's underworld with patience, strategy, and an unwavering grip on control. His rise wasn't loud, it moved in silence, in calculated meetings, in shadows where every decision carried weight and consequence. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these stories alive in the stillness of the night. Now lean back, breathe slow, and let the story of John Stanfa guide you deeper into the quiet. Every night in a quiet federal prison, an old man lies on a narrow bunk and stares at the ceiling. The cell is small, clean, and controlled, a world of rules and numbers. On the paper the guards carry, he is just another inmate serving life. On the metal door, there is only his last name and a number. To the staff, he is calm, polite, rarely a problem. He reads, he prays, he keeps to himself. Yet, if you stepped close and heard the other prisoners talk in low voices after lights out, you would catch his name spoken with a different weight. That's John Stanfa. To some, he is the quiet old-timer from Sicily who minds his own business. To others, especially those who grew up in Philadelphia, he is the man who once ran a crime family, sat in smoky back rooms with powerful figures, and survived a bloody internal war. He was there when a respected mob boss slumped dead in the front seat of a car, his driver untouched but marked forever. He built a construction company while secretly guiding a criminal network, collected envelopes in the shadows, and then lost almost everything in a courtroom where one of his own former allies took the stand against him. On the bunk, he rarely speaks about those days. Still, memory does not care about prison schedules. It comes when the block gets quiet, when the last television clicks off, and only the hum of the vents remains. Faces appear, hard men in suits, soft-spoken priests in Sicilian churches, union leaders, frightened small businessmen, federal agents with tape recorders, and finally jurors staring back at him while a judge reads out life imprisonment. These images drift together like smoke, circling around one question he never answers aloud. How did a boy from a poor hill town in Sicily become the boss of the Philadelphia mob, only to spend the rest of his life behind bars? To understand that, the story has to start far away from metal doors and concrete yards, in a place where the streets were made of dust and stone, and everyone knew everyone's family name. John Stanfa was born on the 7th of December 1940 in Sicilian, a small town on the southern coast of Sicily. It was a harsh time. The island was still feeling the shock of war, and poverty was a fact of life. Most people survived through hard physical work. The houses clung to steep streets. Laundry hung from balconies. Church bells cut through the sound of arguing neighbors and the bleating of goats. Not much official record exists of his early years. He did not grow up with public interviews or memoirs, but from what is known, his childhood was typical of many Sicilian boys of that era. Strict family structure, strong Catholic faith, deep respect for elders, and a constant awareness that real power did not always sit in government buildings. There were men who walked with a certain confidence, who spoke quietly, yet were obeyed. People did not say mafia loudly, but everyone understood that some disputes were settled without police, and some families were not to be crossed. In that environment, silence was a kind of security. Children learned early. You do not repeat what you see or hear in the street. You mind your business. You show loyalty to family. Those habits would later define much of John's life. As he grew older, he learned trades that would follow him for decades. Masonry, construction, working with his hands. In towns like Sicilian, building work wasn't just a job. It was survival. A boy who could carry bricks, mix mortar, repair cracked walls, and keep up with older men could earn a living and contribute to his household. By his late teens, he had the reputation of being serious, quiet, and dependable. Yet, like many young Sicilians, he looked west. Italy was changing, but opportunities were limited. and stories from relatives who had gone to America sounded tempting. The United States, especially cities with large Italian neighborhoods, seemed to offer a way out of the narrow streets and constant scraping by. Philadelphia was one of those cities. In the late 1952, John left Sicily and emigrated to the United States. The journey was not glamorous. Like countless immigrants before him, he arrived with an accent, limited money, and the willingness to take whatever honest work he could find. He settled in Philadelphia, drawn by community ties. South Philadelphia, in particular, felt like a transplanted piece of southern Italy, filled with Italian food shops, corner cafes, and old men who still argued in dialect. He went back to what he knew: construction. Bricklaying, masonry, small building projects, those skills were valued in a city that was constantly changing. He was not a flashy worker. He was reliable. That reliability slowly put his name in front of other immigrants, some of whom had connections far beyond ordinary neighborhood life. In that same city, a man named Angelo Bruno quietly controlled a major organized crime family. Bruno, a Sicilian-born boss, was called the Gentle Don because he preferred low-profile methods and steady income over open warfare. While New York's Underworld sometimes attracted headlines, Bruno kept Philadelphia relatively stable, mixing illegal rackets with a careful effort to avoid unnecessary attention. He valued people who could be trusted to keep their mouths shut and do their jobs without chaos. Somewhere along this path, John Stanfa's world and Angelo Bruno's world merged. Accounts differ on the details of their first meeting, but what is clear is that John eventually came to work for Bruno. His skills in construction were useful for legitimate fronts and quiet projects. His Sicilian background and low-key personality fit the old-style atmosphere Bruno preferred. Step by small step, he moved from being just another worker to becoming one of the men the boss relied on. Over time, John became Bruno's driver and close assistant. That role carried weight. The man behind the wheel often heard private conversations, saw who came and went, and understood the rhythms of the boss's life. Trust was essential. A boss would not let just anyone sit a few feet away while he discussed business or visited important contacts. For John, this position meant access to a world hidden from ordinary residents of South Philadelphia. He would wait outside restaurants, social clubs, and homes while meetings took place. He would see envelopes passed, handshakes exchanged, faces tense or relaxed as deals were made. He learned who feared Bruno, who respected him, and who might be quietly resenting him. Yet, like in his childhood, he kept his observations to himself. Silent, punctual, and loyal, that was his role. During the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds as Bruno continued to rule, John also built up a legitimate business. He started a masonry and construction company, taking contracts for homes, commercial buildings, and later larger projects. On the surface, he appeared to be another hard-working immigrant entrepreneur, using his trade to rise into the middle class. He bought property, supported his family, and strengthened his foothold in America. But in cities with entrenched organized crime, construction was rarely just about bricks and cement. It often intersected with unions, permits, and behind-the-scenes pressure. John's connection to Bruno's organization gave him leverage. According to law enforcement investigations years later, his firm was not only a source of legitimate income, but also a tool used in schemes involving extortion, bid rigging, and control over certain projects through intimidation. At the time, though, little of that surfaced publicly. Outwardly, he was a reserved contractor with powerful friends, nothing more. Then, in 1980, everything changed. The evening of the 21st of March 1980 began like many others for Angelo Bruno. He had a routine, and people around him were used to it. That night, Bruno and John drove through South Philadelphia in a green car after stopping by one of the boss's regular haunts. John took his familiar place behind the wheel. He guided the car down the streets he knew well, past small businesses and row houses lit by soft yellow street lamps. As they pulled up near Bruno's home, the car rolled to a stop at the curb. It was a quiet moment that should have passed without notice, one more uneventful pause at the end of a long day. Instead, it became one of the most important moments in Philadelphia's criminal history. A shotgun blast tore through the stillness, the front seat filled with noise and shattered glass. Neighbors heard the thunderous sound and ran to windows or doors. Seconds later, Bruno lay dying in the passenger seat, killed almost instantly. John, still in the driver's seat, was physically unharmed but suddenly at the center of a firestorm. The killing shocked the city and sent ripples through law enforcement, the media, and the underworld. Bruno had been a stabilizing force. His death signaled that someone had decided to challenge that balance, and whoever did it had chosen a direct and public method. Questions flew. Who ordered it? Who carried it out? And what did the driver know? Police arrived quickly. John, rattled but alive, became a key witness by default. He was the closest person to the boss at the moment of the murder. Detectives questioned him, trying to piece together exactly what happened, who had been following them, whether he saw anything suspicious earlier that day. From the start, he insisted that he knew nothing about the plot, that he had not seen the shooter, that it was a sudden, shocking attack. Law enforcement did not find that answer satisfying. Investigators believed someone in Bruno's inner circle had to know about tensions and possible threats. In their view, a man as careful as Bruno would not have been so vulnerable without warning signs. As the months passed and different suspects emerged in whispers and surveillance reports, the driver's silence hardened into a problem for prosecutors. They called John in front of a federal grand jury, hoping to break through that silence, behind closed doors. With prosecutors pressing him and the threat of charges hanging over his head, he still refused to provide the information they believed he had. Whether he truly did not know who ordered the hit, or whether he chose loyalty to Underworld code over cooperation with the government, remains a matter of debate. What matters for his story is the result. In 1981, federal authorities charged him with perjury and contempt of court, accusing him of lying under oath and refusing to answer key questions about the Bruno murder. He went from the driver of a slain boss to a defendant himself. The trial did not feature bloody crime scene photos or dramatic confessions. Instead, it focused on words. What he said, what he didn't say, and what prosecutors insisted he must know. The jury sided with the government. John was convicted and sentenced to a significant stretch in federal prison. For a man who had built a steady life of business and quiet influence, it was a huge blow. He left his construction company in the hands of others. He left behind his family and the familiar streets of South Philadelphia. The steel doors of a federal penitentiary closed behind him. Yet inside the world he came from, his choice not to cooperate had a very different meaning. In mob circles, serving time without testifying against anyone is seen as proof of loyalty and reliability. An associate who keeps his mouth shut, as they say, earns respect. By going to prison rather than giving investigators what they wanted, John enhanced his standing among certain powerful figures, especially the Sicilian-born factions in Philadelphia and beyond. In the cell, he had time to think, read, and wait. Outside, the Philadelphia crime family struggled with the consequences of Bruno's murder. Power struggles flared. New bosses came and went. Old alliances shifted. While his body sat behind bars, his reputation slowly grew in the minds of men plotting the future of the organization. Years later, when the gates finally opened for him and he walked out of federal custody, he was not returning as just a contractor and former driver. He was returning as a man many viewed as battle-tested, disciplined, and worthy of a larger role in a criminal empire that was, by then, badly fractured and in need of someone to impose order. When he stepped back onto the streets of Philadelphia after his prison term, the city felt familiar yet different. The corner cafes still served strong coffee, old men still argued about soccer and politics on sidewalks, and church doors still opened early. But the quiet balance that Angelo Bruno once maintained was gone. A new generation of criminals had left scars on the city, and the federal government had learned a great deal about how the organization worked. During the years John was locked up, the family had gone through chaos. Angelo Bruno's immediate successor, Phil Testa, died in his own violent ambush. Nicky Scarfo, a hard-edged figure from Atlantic City, clawed his way into control and ruled through fear. Where Bruno favored discretion and negotiation, Scarfo used intimidation and open violence. His era produced many bodies, many informants, and eventually sweeping racketeering cases. By the late 1982, Scarfo and several allies were serving long sentences, some for the rest of their lives. The structure that once felt almost timeless now looked cracked and unstable. John returned to this uncertain landscape with a complicated reputation. On one hand, he was a convicted felon who had stood at the center of a notorious assassination investigation. On the other, he had stayed silent under pressure, refusing to testify against anyone. In underworld circles that valued secrecy above everything, that meant something. Older Sicilian-born figures in Philadelphia and in New York saw him as someone who could be trusted not to bend under government scrutiny. He went back to construction because that was what he knew. He revived and expanded his masonry and building business, putting on the face of a hard-working contractor who had paid his debt to society and wanted to move forward. The company secured contracts, hired crews, and took part in real development projects. On paper, it was legitimate enterprise, blueprints, invoices, union labor, inspections. Beneath that surface, federal investigators would later allege that his business interests were closely tied to racketeering activity. They accused him of using his position and connections to influence which firms got certain jobs, to pressure other companies to pay for labor peace or access, and to skim money from deals through intimidation and secret agreements. According to prosecutors, he was not just laying bricks. He was using the building trades as a quiet way to collect illegal income and reinforce his influence. Law enforcement had not forgotten him. FBI surveillance teams kept track of his meetings, his movements, and his contacts. Agents recorded him visiting social clubs associated with organized crime, talking in parking lots with people they knew from other investigations, and keeping a steady schedule that suggested more than simple business errands. Still, catching a man like John required more than suspicion. He did not shout on the phone. He did not brag in bars. He favored paid phones, face-to-face talks, and old habits of caution learned in Sicily and refined in Bruno's service. Meanwhile, the power vacuum inside the Philadelphia crime family turned into a quiet struggle. With Scarfo locked away and his underboss eventually cooperating with authorities, rival groups argued over who should take charge. Some urged loyalty to Scarfo even from prison. Others believed the family needed distance from his violent legacy to survive. New York bosses, who had an interest in keeping Philadelphia stable, watched closely. It was in this climate that attention shifted to John. He had roots in the Bruno era, when the family made money without constant war. He had strong ties to Sicilian circles in both America and Italy. He had shown he could withstand legal pressure without betraying associates. For older leaders who wanted calm and discipline, he looked like a candidate to restore order. Before long, important people in New York signaled that they were willing to recognize him as the head of the Philadelphia family. This kind of blessing carried great weight. It meant other crime families would treat him as the official authority there. For the government, that step transformed him from a respected figure in the background into the central target. Taking that position was not a simple promotion. It meant he now carried responsibility for a network involved in illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion schemes related to union activity, payments from drug dealers, and pressure on businesses that wanted to avoid trouble. It also meant managing internal rivalries in a city where younger men were impatient and law enforcement was more aggressive than ever. In public, he remained the soft-spoken contractor. He filed paperwork, attended to job sites, and maintained an appearance of ordinary entrepreneurship. In private, he called meetings in quiet restaurants, basement rooms, and back offices. Associates came to him with problems: a bookmaker behind on payments, a debtor trying to stall, a construction outfit refusing to share profits, a union election that could affect control over a key local. He made decisions, delegated tasks, and tried to shape the family into something closer to the structured, low-profile organization he had admired under Bruno. But the world had changed. Federal laws like RICO allowed prosecutors to tie together long patterns of conduct into powerful cases. Hidden microphones sat in social clubs and cars. Younger members of the underworld drank, gambled, and talked more freely than the old-timers liked. The culture of fear Scarfo left behind had pushed some people toward cooperation with authorities. Every move John made occurred in a landscape where one wrong word could end up in a courtroom. Among the people coming up during this time was a group of younger South Philadelphians led by Joseph Joey Merlino. They were the sons and nephews of earlier figures, raised in an environment where mob stories floated through family gatherings and street corners. They did not remember the cautious Bruno years as clearly. They had grown up amid Scarfo's violence, and the constant presence of FBI cars on the block. The young crew had their own ideas about how money should be made and who should control it. Some felt that the older Sicilian generation took the best income sources for themselves while leaving younger men smaller pieces. They wanted a larger share, more visibility, and faster rewards. They spent freely in night spots, gambled heavily, and enjoyed local attention. That attitude clashed with John's preference for quiet stability. At first, there was an attempt at accommodation. John understood that he could not simply ignore a group of energetic, ambitious men with strong neighborhood ties. He brought some of them in closer, giving them positions and responsibilities within the organization. There were ceremonies, carried out in secret, where new members took vows of loyalty and secrecy. These rituals, described years later in court by turncoats, marked the formal entry of several younger figures into the life John now controlled. One of Joey's closest relatives had long been involved in the family's affairs, and John initially treated that connection as a bridge instead of a threat. He believed he could guide the younger generation, keep them under discipline, and use their energy while preventing them from dragging the group into chaos. He assigned territories for bookmaking and loan operations, carved up responsibilities for collecting payments, and tried to keep disputes from spilling onto the sidewalks. Yet resentment simmered. Some of the younger men felt he kept the largest rackets in the hands of loyal Sicilians and older associates, leaving them to fight over what remained. They disliked his reserved personal style and his cautious approach to displays of wealth. They wanted the kind of influence others had enjoyed in flashier times. Open spending, packed social clubs, and visible status. John, for his part, looked at them and saw danger. He saw looseness that could attract attention, talk that might lead to indictments, and impatience that might spark conflict. He had gone to prison partly because he refused to speak. Telling stories at bars or arguing loudly in public seemed, to him, reckless. Still, he tried to avoid open rifts. He used sit-downs to settle arguments, lectured about patience and loyalty, and pushed the message that the real enemy was law enforcement, not each other. He often spoke in low tones, reminding men of what had happened after Bruno's murder: wars, trials, and long sentences. He did not want to preside over another round of that. While these internal tensions grew, the money kept flowing. Illegal gambling operations took bets on sports and numbers. Loan sharking operations lent cash at high interest to people who could not borrow from banks. Small businesses in certain neighborhoods paid to avoid harassment, according to later indictments. Construction contracts went to firms that understood they were expected to send a portion of profits back to the organization. On the side, drug dealers in some corners of the city paid for permission to operate without interference, though John himself publicly denied involvement when such topics arose. The FBI kept gathering evidence. Agents flipped low-level participants, placed wires, and sought court orders for electronic surveillance. They watched who visited John's office, noted which restaurants he favored, and tracked his meetings with known figures from New York. Federal prosecutors believed he was using fear and loyalty to rebuild the family's influence after the Scarfo years, even as he claimed to be nothing more than a businessman trying to leave his past behind. New York bosses still preferred him over the alternatives, at least at first. To them, he represented a tie to old Sicilian traditions and a chance to keep Philadelphia from erupting. They recognized the risk posed by younger, flashier personalities who liked media attention. For a while, their support gave John leverage when dealing with restless underlings. He could say without exaggeration that he had backing from the highest levels of the American underworld, but respect from older leaders in another city did not automatically buy obedience on the streets of South Philadelphia. As months passed, the divide between the two generations widened. Rumors circulated in both directions. Some of John's camp muttered that the young crew was plotting behind his back, spending too much money, and showing him insufficient respect. The younger group claimed that he was greedy, that he favored men from his hometown in Sicily over those born and raised in Philadelphia, and that he had lost touch with changing times. These complaints did not stay confined to private grumbling. Small acts signaled that something deeper was wrong. Messages took longer to be returned. People began skipping certain meetings. Collections from some rackets arrived late or incomplete. A bookmaker who once answered quickly now stalled and gave excuses. A loan collector complained that doors stayed shut and payments slowed because debtors heard that one faction or the other might soon be out of power. John sensed the shift. He tightened his circle, relying more on men whose loyalty he had tested over many years. He also brought in relatives, including one of his sons, giving them roles that placed family ties at the core of his protection. He was no longer just the quiet driver or disciplined soldier. He was a leader who felt the floor under him starting to shake. Government pressure added to his worries. He heard whispers of new investigations, of grand juries meeting in federal buildings downtown, of subpoenas delivered to people on the edges of his world. Some of his lawyers advised him to stay away from certain gatherings, to hold sensitive talks in places where he believed microphones could not easily reach. The more he tried to adjust, though, the clearer it became that the network of surveillance around him was growing tighter. By the early 1992, the Philadelphia family was effectively split into two camps. The older Sicilian, aligned group around John, and the younger South Philadelphia faction clustering around Joey and his friends. What began as differences over money and style grew into questions about who had the right to lead, who truly represented the city, and who had the toughness to withstand law enforcement and rivals alike. In that tense atmosphere, even small slights could spark serious reactions. A cold greeting at a social club, an insult passed through a third party, in a dispute over territory. It all fed a sense that the situation was moving towards something more than arguments. Some people tried to stay neutral, hoping to survive, regardless of who came out on top. Others quietly chose sides, visited one set of hangouts more than the other, and adjusted their behavior based on who they believed would eventually win. John had lived through one major upheaval already when Angelo Bruno died beside him in that car. He knew how quickly a single act could send shockwaves through an entire organization. Sitting in the back rooms of his construction office, or over late-night coffee with his closest advisors, he weighed his options. He could try again to compromise, handing over more income and authority to the young crew in hopes of avoiding further strain. Or he could make a stand, using his experience, connections, and remaining loyalty to push back hard. He chose to stand his ground. Once that decision settled in, the path ahead narrowed. In a world where disputes were rarely settled by lawyers or formal arbitration, a leadership struggle of this magnitude almost never ended with simple words. Tension turned into planning, and planning began to circle around a question that would soon change Philadelphia's streets again. Who would strike first? Once he decided he would not step aside, he tried to solve the problem the way old bosses always had, through quiet pressure, not open chaos. He told his closest people that money owed to his side had to be collected in full and on time. He ordered that no one change allegiances without speaking to him first. Territory that had been informally shared now got clearer borders. He reminded everyone that he had the recognition of powerful New York leaders, and that in their world, that recognition meant legitimacy. His message was simple. There was only one boss. For a while, the conflict stayed mostly beneath the surface. Arguments happened behind closed doors. A bookmaker who leaned toward the younger group got a stern visit. A minor associate lost his job on a construction site after being seen in the wrong company. People got pushed, warned, or quietly sidelined. No bullets yet, but the temperature kept rising. The younger crew around Joey did not back down. They held their own gatherings, issued their own instructions, and took in their own payments. When they were told to give up certain rackets or hand over part of what they collected, they stalled or simply refused. Their view was that they were the future of South Philadelphia, that the neighborhoods respected them, and that an older Sicilian with business ties and out-of-town backing did not truly represent the street anymore. Police and FBI agents could feel the change. Wiretaps and informants started reporting heated conversations, harsh words about loyalty, and not-so-veiled talk of what might happen next. Detectives who had lived through the Scarfo years heard familiar tones creeping back into the city. The feeling that people were choosing sides in something that would not end with handshakes. In that environment, it only took a few sparks to start a full fire. First came small acts of sabotage. A car belonging to someone in John's camp was vandalized. A friendly bar owner was suddenly told by another group that he needed to pay them instead. A union contact who long answered to John's people began returning calls from the younger side first. Each of these incidents on its own might have been dismissed. Taken together, they looked like a campaign. John responded by tightening his grip. He relied more heavily on people who shared his background from Sicily and on a handful of American-born associates who had proven their loyalty during earlier troubles. According to later federal testimony, he also reached across the ocean, bringing in Sicilian-born men to bolster his protection and carry out delicate tasks. These new arrivals blended into the old country social pattern of South Philadelphia, speaking the same dialects and fitting naturally into certain coffee shops and social clubs. To the public, the story still sounded like rumors. There were whispers about disagreements, about two different sets of men calling themselves the real Philadelphia mob. Newspapers occasionally hinted at factional struggles. But nothing had yet exploded loudly enough to command front pages. That changed when bullets finally came out in daylight. By the early 1990s, tension turned into a series of attacks that the press would later call a mob war. This conflict was not a single dramatic event. It was a chain of attempts and counter-attempts, some successful, some not, stretching over months. Each one added fear in the neighborhoods and urgency in law enforcement offices. One target was Joey himself. Late one night, he and friends moved through the city in a car, as they often did, traveling between hangouts. Gunmen opened fire on the vehicle from another car, aiming to end the challenge in one decisive strike. The attack did not go exactly as planned. One of Joey's closest friends, a fellow rising figure from South Philadelphia, lost his life. Joey was injured, but survived. The message was clear. John's side was willing to go after the heart of the younger crew. The surviving younger men took that message and turned it into fuel. Instead of retreating, they grew more determined. At funerals and hospital bedside visits, bonds tightened and revenge took root. Law enforcement sources later described this period as a cycle where each incident fed the next. An action from one side almost guaranteed a response from the other. John, for his part, moved more carefully but refused to disappear from view. He still drove through the city, visited construction sites, and attended certain social spots. He often traveled with trusted men and sometimes with one of his sons. He believed his experience and planning would be enough to keep him safe, even as everyone around him understood that he now wore a target. One day, during a busy traffic period, that target became very real. John was driving on a crowded highway, his car moving with the flow as commuters and families filled the lanes. Without warning, another vehicle pulled up alongside. Gunmen opened fire, spraying bullets into the side of his car in full view of stunned drivers around them. It was the kind of brazen act that showed just how far the conflict had gone. An attempted killing on a major road in broad daylight, with total disregard for the risk to strangers. Somehow, John survived. He and his relative in the car were hit but lived long enough to reach medical help. The incident left him wounded but alive, and it pushed public awareness of the war to a new level. Local television shows ran footage of the pockmarked car and interviews with terrified witnesses. The idea that old-fashioned mob rules kept violence hidden from ordinary life no longer held. Inside the underworld, some saw his survival as proof of resilience, almost as if he had been spared for a reason. Others saw it as evidence that the younger faction would not stop until he was removed, one way or another. From the government's perspective, it showed that patience was no longer an option. Innocent people could have been harmed. Political pressure mounted for decisive action. The war did not pause. Later that same summer, there was another bold move. This time, the target was Joey and his crew again. They were stuck in traffic when shooters came at them, turning another ordinary city moment into a scene of panic. One of Joey's key allies was struck and killed. Joey himself was hit but survived once more. Car horns, screeching tires, and the sound of gunfire echoed between concrete barriers as drivers scrambled to get away. To the wider public, this was frightening and surreal. To investigators, it was another sign that both camps were fully committed. Neither side seemed willing to step back. Neighbors in South Philadelphia heard the news and shook their heads, remembering the days after Bruno's death when similar waves of fear washed through the area. Behind the scenes, federal agents pieced together what they could. They assembled charts, connecting nicknames, family ties, union positions, and construction businesses. They compared notes with state and local police, matching ballistics reports with wiretap transcripts and informant statements. They looked at the highway shootings, the earlier attacks, and several other killings and attempted killings that did not make as much news, but were linked in pattern and motive. One major breakthrough for the government came from inside John's own circle. A tough young enforcer named John Veazey, who had joined the organization under John's leadership, was deeply involved in the conflict. He had carried out violent acts, followed orders, and tried to prove himself loyal. Then his brother, William, a non-mob plumber with no real role in the life, was killed. William's death, tied to power struggles and suspected betrayals, shook Veazey to his core. He began to question what loyalty meant if his own family could be sacrificed. That questioning led him to prosecutors. When he came in from the cold and started cooperating, he brought with him first-hand knowledge of meetings, orders, and details from the war years. In court later, he would describe how John's camp operated, how targets were chosen, and how efforts were made to track rivals' movements. For investigators building a large racketeering case, this was gold. Veazey's cooperation, combined with taped conversations, surveillance logs, financial records, and earlier informant reports, allowed prosecutors to put together a sweeping picture of John's leadership. They connected him to attempted killings of Joey and others, to the highway ambush where his own car was attacked, to extortion schemes tied to construction and unions, and to plots against people seen as disloyal or dangerous. As this work advanced, John tried to keep running both his criminal operations and his legitimate business. He continued to visit construction offices, hold quiet meetings, and send messages through trusted go-betweens. But by now, the pressure was visible. Associates were being called before grand juries again. Some disappeared from the usual hangouts, either because they were in hiding, in custody, or quietly cooperating. Old certainties about who could be trusted began to fade. His relationship with New York also felt the strain. The bosses there had initially supported him as a stabilizing figure, someone who could bring discipline back to Philadelphia. Instead, they now saw headlines about brazen shootings and a bloody power struggle, the very things they had hoped to avoid. Their patience had limits, and their willingness to back a leader who attracted so much attention started to waver. Inside his own ranks, fear grew sharper. Men loyal to him watched the younger faction continue to operate in the city, gathering in clubs and restaurants, shaking hands with people they once shared tables with. They knew that as long as both camps had strength, neither side could truly relax. Some quietly sent feelers to see whether they might be allowed to switch sides if John fell. Others doubled down on loyalty, convinced that turning on a boss would only make their own futures worse. John had chosen to stand and fight. That choice now led him to a place where options narrowed each day. He could not easily flee. He was too well known and too deeply tied to local businesses and social networks. He could not openly surrender his position without inviting revenge from those who had lost family and friends in the war. He could not negotiate a truce that satisfied both his own wounded faction and the emboldened younger crew. Each path in front of him seemed blocked. The one force he could not control, however, was the government. While he weighed his next move, prosecutors finalized theirs. Federal law gave them the ability to treat years of criminal conduct as a single ongoing enterprise rather than a set of isolated incidents. They could argue that extortion of business owners, control over unions, illegal gambling income, loan sharking, and the pattern of attacks on rivals were all part of one organized criminal conspiracy under his direction. Agents worked long hours, drafting affidavits and organizing evidence. Witnesses were placed under protection. Some recordings were transcribed and marked to be played in court someday. By the time their work reached its peak, they believed they had built a case not just against John, but against several key figures around him. The war on the streets had begun as a struggle over who would rule Philadelphia's underworld. It was soon clear that another front had opened, one that neither faction could shoot its way out of. In offices stacked with files and evidence boxes, the government was preparing something that had ended many mob careers in other cities, a racketeering indictment aimed at the top. When that indictment finally came down in the mid-1990 seconds, it landed like a hammer. Federal marshals and agents fanned out with arrest warrants. Homes were raided, offices searched, and men who once moved freely through South Philadelphia were handcuffed and loaded into vehicles. The long, noisy conflict between the two street factions stopped being the only story. Now, another chapter was beginning, in courtrooms and detention centers, where power looked very different and where John would no longer control the pace or direction of events. The morning the federal indictment dropped, the knock on his door came early. It was not the quiet tap of a neighbor or the heavy bang of a bill collector. It was firm, practiced, and backed by the weight of a grand jury. When he opened up, agents stood there with badges out and papers in hand. They moved in with controlled urgency, reading him his rights, steering him away from phones and files, while others began to search. He kept his expression steady. This was not his first encounter with federal law. Years before, Bruno's murder case had led to his conviction for lying to a grand jury. He understood the formal language, the way agents spoke, the rhythm of a federal arrest. Still, the scope felt different. This time, they were not asking about one night in 1980. They were accusing him of running a criminal organization for years. He was taken into custody and moved to a federal detention center. The process was routine for the marshals. Fingerprints, photographs, clothing, swapped for jail-issue garments. Property locked away. For him, each step signaled that a long chapter of his life might be closing. Outside, in South Philadelphia and beyond, word spread quickly. Men who had collected envelopes for him, who greeted him respectfully in cafes and back rooms, heard that their boss was in federal hands. The indictment was thick. It named John as the head of a racketeering enterprise and listed a string of accusations, directing extortion against business owners, influencing unions, skimming from construction projects, overseeing illegal gambling and high-interest loans, and ordering or approving attempts on rivals during the internal war. Specific episodes were laid out. Plots against Joey and his associates, the highway shootings, violent actions against suspected traitors, threats toward witnesses, and pressure on contractors to fall in line. For prosecutors, this document told a single story. In their view, every envelope passed, every threat delivered, every bullet fired during those years was part of one criminal plan with him at the top. They wanted the jury to see not isolated crimes, but a system. He was held without bail. The court agreed with the government's argument that he posed both a risk of flight and a danger to others. He had foreign ties in Sicily, steady access to money, and a history of involvement in a violent dispute. From a cold legal standpoint, the decision was predictable. For him, it meant he would fight his case from behind bars. Inside the detention facility, he settled into a routine. He read legal papers, spoke with lawyers through glass or at conference tables, walked in the small recreation area, and watched the evening news when the channels carried stories about his own case. On television, commentators spoke about him as a mob boss. Reporters stood outside courthouses, describing his alleged role in the war, and calling him the head of the Bruno Scarfo family or the Philadelphia crime family. To the media, those labels flowed easily. Inside the jail, he remained quiet, polite to staff, reserved with other inmates. On the streets, his arrest changed everything. The younger faction gained breathing room. With him confined, their rivals lost their central figure. Some of his people tried to carry on, but the structure was weakened. Those who had followed him out of loyalty to his Sicilian roots and New York backing now had to weigh their options. Some stayed loyal. Some drifted. A few began to speak with law enforcement. One of the most damaging voices still belonged to John Veazey. Already cooperating, he now became a central witness around whom prosecutors built much of their case. In recorded debriefings, he laid out the inner workings of the Stanfa camp, the planning that led to attacks, the way directions were passed, how money was collected from bookmakers and loan customers, how construction businesses were leaned on. His cooperation came at a high personal cost. Men loyal to John tried to silence him. While Veazey was in a witness program and on his way to testify, gunmen ambushed him on a street, shooting him multiple times. Against the odds, he survived. To prosecutors, the attempt showed exactly what they had argued about the danger posed by the organization. To a future jury, it would reinforce the image of a group willing to go far to protect itself. Government lawyers did not rely on one witness alone. They brought in financial experts to trace money from construction accounts. They called union officials who, under subpoena, explained how certain companies were favored, how contracts seemed to land repeatedly in the laps of firms connected to John, and how fear quietly guided decision-making. They introduced tapes from hidden microphones placed in social clubs and cars, where voices discussed debts, problems that needed to be taken care of, and complaints about disloyal people. Preparing for trial, John and his defense team sifted through this mountain of material. They challenged the credibility of cooperators, pointing out that these men had their own criminal records and powerful reasons to curry favor with the government. They argued that prosecutors were turning business disputes, personal grudges, and neighborhood tensions into a single conspiracy. The defense insisted that he was a legitimate constructor who had been drawn into sensational accusations because of his past and because law enforcement wanted a figurehead to blame. He rarely spoke publicly. In court appearances before the trial, he answered basic questions formally and left most talking to his lawyers. He gave no press conferences, wrote no letters to newspapers. His posture stayed the same as it had been for decades. Say only what you must, and nothing more. When the trial finally began in federal court in Philadelphia, security was tight. Marshals checked bags and screened visitors. The courtroom filled with attorneys, reporters, sketch artists, and sometimes family members of both defendants and alleged victims. Prospective jurors were questioned at length about their ability to be fair in a case involving organized crime, publicity, and violence. Once a panel was chosen, opening statements framed the clash. Prosecutors stood and described an organization built on intimidation and hidden control, with John as the man who approved promotions, resolved disputes, and gave the nod when someone was to be harmed. They outlined the war years, the highway ambushes, the drive-by attacks, and the extortion of business owners who feared refusing requests from his people. Defense lawyers countered that narrative. They painted cooperators like Veazey as self-serving, saying they had committed serious wrongs themselves, and were now blaming their misdeeds on a man with a reputation that made him an easy target. They stressed that their client had worked for decades in construction, building a company from scratch, and that he had already served time for not cooperating in the Bruno inquiry. That earlier conviction, they argued, showed he had been punished once for silence and was now being punished again because authorities could not let go of old grudges. Witness after witness took the stand. Some were mob associates who had decided to help the government. They spoke in sometimes halting tones about meetings in back rooms, handshake deals, and coded language. Jurors heard descriptions of ceremonies where new members were welcomed into the group after pledging loyalty. They heard how payments were collected from gamblers, how loans were made to desperate shopkeepers at interest rates that nearly guaranteed default, and what happened when people failed to pay. Others were ordinary workers. A small businessman who described visits from two men who hinted that accidents could happen if certain bills were not paid. A contractor who explained how bids were steered and how he was told to submit certain numbers to keep everybody happy. A union man who said his vote in internal elections came with pressure he did not feel he could resist. Throughout it all, John listened intently, sometimes writing notes to his attorneys, sometimes studying the witnesses' faces. He rarely showed emotion, even when hearing accounts of attacks that he knew had changed lives and sent shockwaves through the neighborhoods he once called his own. The government's case tied these stories together with physical evidence. There were ledgers from gambling operations, lists of names and numbers that matched telephone records and bank deposits. There were seized firearms linked by ballistics to earlier crimes, introduced not with lurid emphasis but as cold data points in a larger pattern. There were recordings where voices identified by agents based on surveillance and informants spoke about resolving disputes, taking care of people, and dividing income from various ventures. Defense attorneys cross-examined vigorously. They confronted cooperators with their own lies and past acts, asking why the jury should trust them now. They pressed small businessmen on details, whether they had ever actually been physically injured, whether they might have feared the idea of the mob more than any explicit threat from their client. They questioned the interpretations agents put on snippets of taped conversation, suggesting alternative meanings for vague phrases. They tried to separate John from the most serious acts, arguing that there was no direct proof he personally ordered specific attempts, that he was being held responsible simply because of who he was. In a racketeering case, however, the boss often does not need to be on the scene to be held responsible. The government leaned on that legal structure. They reminded jurors, through instructions and closing arguments, that if they believed there was an ongoing criminal enterprise and that the defendant directed or assisted it, he could be found guilty for patterns of activity carried out by others, acting in furtherance of that structure. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the trial moved into deliberation. The jury retreated behind closed doors with stacks of exhibits, notebooks full of notes, and lengthy instructions from the judge. In the detention center, John waited. He had been through a smaller version of this years earlier, when a grand jury case led to his first federal conviction. This time, The stakes were immeasurably higher. There would be no short sentence and return to construction if the government prevailed. A guilty verdict here likely meant he would never walk freely in Philadelphia again. When the jurors filed back in and the foreperson stood to read, the courtroom grew still. One by one, counts were announced. On the main racketeering charge, guilty. On conspiracy counts, tied to specific plots and acts of violence, guilty. On extortion counts linked to business owners and cash collections, guilty. The list went on. He remained composed, his expression steady as he listened to the words he had suspected were coming. Around him, defense lawyers scribbled notes, prosecutors exhaled quietly, and some spectators shook their heads in grim recognition of what the verdict meant. Sentencing came later. Before imposing punishment, the judge spoke about the harm done, not only to the direct targets of attempted killings and extortion, but also to neighborhoods weighed down for years by fear, and to industries distorted by hidden influence. The court saw him not as a simple bricklayer who lost his way, but as the guiding figure in a long-running criminal structure. The punishment reflected that view. He received multiple life sentences, effectively guaranteeing that he would spend the rest of his days in federal custody. Additional years were added on top of the life terms for firearms and related crimes, a symbolic measure that underlined the court's message. There would be no second return to the streets, no chance at a quiet retirement in South Philadelphia or back in Sicily. Given a chance to speak, he did not admit guilt. He maintained that the government had relied on untrustworthy cooperators and stretched ordinary business conflicts into something larger. He did not beg for mercy or offer apologies for specific acts. In keeping with the way he had lived his life in that world, he chose restraint, accepting the sentence outwardly without display. Shortly after, he was moved from the local detention center to a long-term federal facility. Guards placed him on a transport bus, then later on a plane, as part of a group of inmates being reassigned. When he arrived at his new institution, a higher security prison far from the row houses and cafes, he knew he became in the paperwork another number among many serving life. On the compound, though, word spread quickly. Inmates who followed organized crime cases recognized his name and his face from newspaper sketches or television reports. Inside prison, his life narrowed to routines, early counts, meals in the chow hall, limited recreation, set times for phone calls and visits. He kept mostly to himself, as he had outside. He read a lot, often religious texts and Italian-language newspapers when he could get them. He occasionally attended chapel, sat with a small group of older inmates, and avoided the loud arguments that filled common areas. To younger prisoners curious about his past, he rarely told stories. Silence remained his default protection, even when the outside world knew far more about his life than it once had. Back in Philadelphia, the war on the streets slowed after his conviction. Without him to anchor one side, the younger faction faced less organized resistance. Joey emerged as the visible face of the remnants of the family, at least for a time, though he too would face his own federal trial and prison term later. From a distance, John could only watch through scraps of news as power shifted again, as new names rose in headlines, and as the cycle of investigation, indictment, and conviction repeated with another generation. He appealed, as most federal defendants do in such cases. His lawyers argued about evidentiary rulings, jury instructions, and the scope of the racketeering statute. Appellate judges reviewed transcripts, motions, and legal arguments. In the end, the convictions and sentences stood. The courts agreed with the trial judge that the evidence had been sufficient and the procedures proper. With that, the legal path narrowed almost completely. Except for the most remote possibilities of future changes in law or policy, his fate was sealed. The boy from Sicilian, who had once carried bricks in narrow streets, the driver who sat next to Angelo Bruno the night the old boss died, the contractor who mixed legitimate business with hidden influence, and the man who claimed the Philadelphia throne with New York's blessing. Now he was an aging inmate following predictable prison schedules. At night, in his cell, he sometimes thought about how many choices along the way had seemed small at the time. A favor granted, a meeting attended, a warning delivered, a refusal to speak in front of a grand jury. Each decision had carried him further along a path that felt almost ordinary on some days, but, when viewed as a whole, had brought him to a place he could not leave. In the years after the judge pronounced life without parole, the noise around his name slowly faded from the front pages, But his story did not end. It simply moved out of sight. Once the appeals were filed and denied, the legal part of his battle was essentially over. The federal system does not offer parole in the old sense. A life sentence there means what it says. He entered the long, flat landscape of years that look very similar from one to the next. Reports about his day-to-day existence behind bars are sparse. He did not give interviews or write memoirs. What is known comes mostly from official records and people who crossed his path inside. They describe an aging man who carried himself with the same quiet composure he'd shown on the street and in court. He did not boast about old days, did not seek attention in the yard, and did not involve himself in the loud dramas that can consume a prison block. He gravitated toward routine. Early wake-ups, counts, meals, time in the library, time in the chapel, brief calls home when permitted. He read heavily. Fellow inmates noticed him with newspapers, especially those that carried national crime coverage, and with Italian language materials when he could obtain them. Religious books appeared often in his hands, a link back to the Catholic rituals of his Sicilian childhood. He aged in a place where time works differently. In his 40s and 50s, he had paced construction sites and back rooms, carried himself like a man in charge. In custody, his shoulders gradually rounded, his hair grayed, and his health inevitably followed the path of most men who reach their 70s. Yet, unlike many from his generation of organized crime figures, he never chose cooperation as a way out. No public record shows him taking the stand for the government against former associates. He became one of the old guard examples law enforcement would point to when they contrasted the silence of earlier decades with the wave of informants that came later. While he adapted to the routines of confinement, the world he had once ruled kept changing. In Philadelphia, the younger faction that had fought him continued operating for a few years. Joey and his crew became the face of the family that remained on the street, at least informally. They frequented restaurants and clubs, collected from bookmakers and loan customers, and tried to put their stamp on what was left of the organization. Newspapers that once wrote about the Stanfa regime now ran headlines about the Merlino era. From his cell, John heard about these developments through television news, occasional newspaper stories that reached the prison, and letters or phone calls from relatives. Reports filtered in about who had taken over which corners, who had drifted away, who had been indicted. He knew the cycle well enough to see what was coming. In every major American city where the mob had flourished, the pattern repeated. Old bosses removed by cases built over years, new leaders stepping in with confidence, then finding themselves, sooner or later, facing their own turn in front of federal judges. That cycle reached his successors too. Federal agents did not stop working on Philadelphia after his conviction. They turned their attention to the younger camp, using many of the same methods that had been so effective against him. Long-term investigations, wiretaps, hidden microphones, and efforts to flip key insiders. Some of the very men who had risen by defying him would eventually face wide-ranging racketeering charges of their own, with former allies testifying against them. He watched this arc unfold from a distance. The details varied: different cases, different cooperating witnesses, new judges, fresh agents, but the outline was familiar. For him, it reinforced a hard fact that had hovered over his own career. Once the federal government committed to dismantling an organized crime group, time and resources were on their side. Meanwhile, prosecutors and academics picked apart his case in writings and lectures. Law reviews and criminology texts used the Stanfa faction war and the 1994-1995 racketeering trial as examples of how internal mob disputes made families vulnerable to law enforcement. They highlighted several points. He had tried to stabilize a shaky organization by blending legitimate construction business with traditional rackets. He relied on old-world ties to Sicily and to New York bosses to solidify his power. He refused to cooperate under pressure, even after a previous prison term. Yet, despite his discipline, he presided over a period of open conflict that drew public outrage and sharpened the government's focus. Court opinions from his appeals laid out specific conduct the jury had found him responsible for. The judges described how his group collected money from illegal betting operations, lent cash at steep interest to people who could not borrow from banks, and leaned on contractors who wanted labor, peace, or access to certain jobs. They referenced the factional shootings, the plans to eliminate rivals, and the attempt on a government witness that nearly cost that man his life. These were not sensational accounts from newspapers. They were the sober findings that justified keeping him behind bars for the rest of his natural life. Those documents made clear that his reach had extended far beyond one neighborhood. Through construction and union influence, his circle touched public and private projects, affecting where taxpayer money flowed and who received certain contracts. Investigators revealed that fear of his organization had shaped decisions in boardrooms and union halls, not just in corner bars. Inside prison walls, though, none of that history came with him in an official way. To the Bureau of Prisons, he was an inmate with a specific security classification and a well-documented past, but daily life reduced him to the same routines as everyone else. Guards called him by his last name and number. Medical staff treated his ailments like those of any aging prisoner. The system did not formally care that he had once been recognized as a boss in the underworld. Occasionally, he would cross paths with other inmates who knew his story from their own cases or from growing up in Philadelphia. Some approached with a kind of quiet respect, not only because of his role in the mob, but because he had not, in their eyes, broken the old code by becoming an informant. In prison subculture, that point still carried weight. Others saw him simply as an older man who had lost a war. A lesson in what can happen when someone stays too long in a life that almost always ends badly. He stayed in touch with family as much as restrictions allowed. Visits were less frequent than they would have been in a state facility closer to Philadelphia. Federal placements sometimes put inmates hundreds or thousands of miles from home. When relatives did come, they sat across from him in monitored visiting rooms, talking over plastic tables about births, illnesses, marriages, and everyday problems he could no longer help solve personally. Those meetings reminded him of a world that kept moving outside, one in which children grew up, old friends passed away, and entire blocks changed character without his presence. His name still appeared in occasional law enforcement testimony and media retrospectives. When new federal trials in Philadelphia dealt with organized crime, agents and cooperating witnesses sometimes referenced the period when he was boss as background. Younger jurors heard about the Stanfa era, the way he had once heard elders speak about earlier bosses. Time folded in on itself that way. As the years went on, more of his contemporaries died in custody. Some succumbed to health problems. Others were transferred to medical centers, never to return to regular cell blocks. Each passing underlined that life sentences were not abstract ideas, but concrete endpoints. For some, obituaries mentioned that they had once worked with or against him. In those brief notices, he became part of the background story to someone else's life. If he ever reflected on what might have happened had he taken a different path, choosing to stay only a builder, refusing deeper involvement with Angelo Bruno's circle, or leaving Philadelphia after his first prison term, he did so privately. Publicly, his stance never changed. He did not sit down with authors for sympathetic portraits, did not release statements of regret or defiance. Silence remained his main defense, even when there was little left for silence to protect. Law enforcement officials sometimes contrasted his approach with that of new wave cooperators. In training sessions, they pointed out that earlier generations of bosses like him often absorbed their sentences without turning, while later figures flipped quickly to save themselves. His refusal to cooperate made prosecutions against his own camp harder in some ways, but the war he presided over also gave investigators ample grounds to pursue underlings. Once men like VZ came forward, the need for a boss's direct testimony diminished. In Philadelphia itself, younger residents grew up with only a faint sense of his name. To them, the back and forth between factions in the early 1990 seconds felt like distant history, something they might stumble across in an old documentary or a podcast. They knew current headlines about opioids, street gangs, and new kinds of organized crime far better than the story of a Sicilian bricklayer who rose, for a few years, to command a mafia family. Yet for people who studied the decline of traditional organized crime in American cities, his case remained important. It showed how a man who understood secrecy, who had real business skills and old country discipline, could still be brought down when violence spilled into public, and when technology and law had finally caught up to the inner workings of the mob. His life became a reference point in discussions about how the FBI altered its tactics after the 1970 seconds, how RICO prosecutions worked in practice, and how internal wars often did as much damage to crime families as law enforcement did. By the time he was well into his 70s, the contrast between his first years in America and his final decades became stark. He had arrived as a young immigrant with strong hands and limited English, taking any construction work he could find. He had slowly entered Bruno's circle, driven the old boss around Philadelphia's streets, sat only a few feet away on the night of that legendary assassination. He had gone to prison once for refusing to talk, come back to build a larger business and claim leadership over a battered crime family, and then fought a war that left bodies, indictments, and fear behind. Now, in a federal cell, the world narrowed to routine. Medical visits became more frequent. The faces of guards and staff grew younger as his own features aged. Men serving shorter terms arrived, told stories about new investigations or new street problems in Philadelphia, then disappeared again when they made parole or completed their time. He remained, a fixed point, as waves of inmates came and went. The Bureau of Prisons online locator showed his name, year of birth, and sentence status, life, projected release date listed as unknown. That small database entry summed up the final reality of his life better than any long article. There was no scheduled date on which he would walk out, no official expectation that he would ever leave federal custody alive. In the outside world, organized crime adapted. Some traditional rackets shrank under legal gambling, changing markets, and smarter banking systems. Others evolved, moved more into fraud, drugs, and cyber schemes. New faces appeared in law enforcement press releases. Many of them had no direct connection to him. The underworld he had known, union halls, construction sites, envelopes tucked into coat pockets in smoky clubs, was becoming, slowly, a thing of the past. Still, for those who remembered, the name John Stanfa carried a particular meaning. It evoked a specific moment when an old-style Sicilian boss tried to restabilize a wounded family, only to get pulled into a modern, televised, heavily documented war that left him in shackles. His life traced the rise and fall of one of America's mid-sized mafia families, from the quiet, careful Bruno years, through chaos, crackdown, and long-term incarceration. In the cell where he spends his nights, that history does not change. The sentences imposed in the mid-1990 seconds remain in force. Appeals are closed. The underworld has moved on. Yet the path that took him from Siciliana's stone streets to South Philadelphia's row houses, then from a highway ambush to a federal courtroom, still hangs over him every time a guard walks past his door and glances at the name on the metal plate. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons in prison, letters arrive for him from people he had never met. Law students working on papers, amateur historians, true crime writers, even the occasional curious fan of mafia stories. They all wanted something from him. They asked how it felt to drive Angelo Bruno, what he remembered about the night the boss died, why he chose war instead of peace in the early 1990 seconds, whether he regretted anything. Some politely requested interviews, others sent long lists of questions. He almost never answered. When he did respond at all, the replies were short, polite, and contained little more than thanks for writing and a line or two about his health. He had spent a lifetime guarding information. He saw no reason to open up now, especially when it could only feed more books, more documentaries, more debates about a life that, for him, had already been judged. If those writers wanted to understand what he had done, the clearest record lay not in his letters, but in court transcripts and investigative files. There, in dry legal language, his criminal history was laid out. From the late 1960 seconds onward, first as a close aide to Bruno and later as a leader himself, he moved in a world where cash flowed through rackets hidden behind ordinary life. Back then, illegal gambling was one of the main sources of underworld income. Bookmakers took bets on everything from football games to daily number drawings. If you walked into certain bars or back rooms in South Philadelphia, you could quietly place a wager, write your number on a slip of paper, and hand over a few dollars. Behind those low-key transactions stood people like him. Under Bruno, he helped ensure that the right percentage of profits went up the chain. When someone fell behind paying the office, as they sometimes called it, he or another trusted man would show up and sort it out. The visits did not always involve direct threats, but the message was clear enough. The betting business ran under their watch, and those who participated owed a share. Loan sharking followed a similar pattern. People who could not walk into a bank for a loan because of poor credit, gambling debts, or fear of official paperwork went instead to men connected to the family. They borrowed a few thousand at high interest, hoping to pay it back quickly. When they could not, payments mounted, Prosecutors later described how collections were enforced. Late payers were pressured at work, confronted outside their homes, or visited by tough-looking men who made it plain that default was not an option. In that network, he was more than a collector. He was somebody others answered to. The construction world offered him a bridge between legitimate business and hidden crime. His masonry and building firm took real contracts and performed real work. But investigators would later show how that business fit into a larger plan. Through influence over a union or quiet agreements with certain contractors, his circle could steer work, block rivals, and demand under-the-table payments. A contractor who wanted to avoid headaches at a job site might suddenly find that union issues eased up after having a friendly meeting at a particular cafe. Another firm discovered that its bids were always slightly too high or too low until it understood the unwritten rules. According to the case the government built, these patterns were not accidents. They were the result of pressure directed from above, pressure he helped apply. For years, much of this activity stayed in the shadows. Even after Bruno's murder and his own perjury conviction, many of the people on the receiving end of these schemes kept quiet. Some feared retaliation. Others thought going to the police would not change anything. It took the chaos of the early 1990 seconds and the willingness of insiders like John Veazey to talk for the full picture to emerge. Veazey's testimony laid out in detail how messages traveled from his cell block's quiet elder down to the men with guns. Veazey described meetings where complaints were brought to him, a debtor who refused to pay, a man suspected of siding with the younger faction, a bookmaker thought to be skimming. In those conversations, there were rarely explicit sentences like, "Go kill him," spelled out word for word. Instead, he heard phrases that everyone in that world understood. "He's got to be taken care of," or "We can't let this stand," or "Do what you have to do." Prosecutors argued that these vague phrases were not harmless. In the context of mob structure, when a boss made those remarks about a specific person, it was effectively a green light for violence. Jurors agreed. The violent side of his career came into sharp focus around the war with Joey's crew. Evidence at trial connected him to numerous plans and attempts. Government witnesses recounted stakeouts, car switches, and hurried conferences after attacks. Veazey in particular told the jury how he was directed to keep pressure on the younger group, how information about their movements was valued, and how important it was considered to strike back quickly whenever they hit one of his side. One of the most chilling episodes, from a legal standpoint, was the killing of Veazey's brother, William. William was not a mobster. He worked an ordinary job and had no meaningful role in the factional struggle. Yet he died because his relative, a trusted enforcer, was suspected of disloyalty. By targeting William, the killers hoped to send a message and maybe shake Veazey into compliance. The plan backfired completely. Instead of cowing him, it pushed him into the arms of federal agents. He chose to cooperate, not only to protect himself, but also because he could not accept that his own brother's life had been used as a bargaining chip. That choice opened a window into how the boss's orders filtered downward, how personal relationships were twisted into leverage, and how far the organization was willing to go to keep control. The attempt on Veazey's own life later underscored the same theme. As he moved toward testifying, gunmen caught him on the street and opened fire. Shot repeatedly, he somehow survived. When jurors in John's case heard about that effort to silence a witness, they saw more than just another act of violence. They saw a pattern of obstruction. Prosecutors used these events to argue that he was not simply overseeing money-making ventures, but actively managing a system that used intimidation and deadly force when needed. Combined with the extortion of business owners and control over gambling and loans, it formed the backbone of the racketeering conviction. From the outside, it can be tempting to treat those acts as scenes in a crime movie, but for the people caught in them, they were life-changing. A shop owner who paid each month to avoid trouble had to charge his customers more or cut corners elsewhere. A worker pushed into supporting a certain union candidate carried that decision home to his family, worrying what might happen if he resisted next time. A gambler pulled deeper into debt lost not just money but sometimes marriages and homes. In later years, social scientists and journalists interviewed some of these people, though most spoke anonymously. They described the quiet pressure as worse than physical danger in some ways, because it was constant. The phone calls at odd hours, the unannounced visits, the way certain men would appear at a job site just long enough to be noticed, all of it built a climate where saying no felt nearly impossible. His leadership style shaped how that system worked. Those who dealt with him directly described him in similar terms: reserved, seldom raising his voice, preferring to speak in calm tones that made his expectations sound almost reasonable. This restraint could make him seem less threatening moment to moment, but under it lay the same reality. When he wanted something done, people moved. Law enforcement agents who pursued him over the years learned to recognize his fingerprints in patterns rather than single events. An investigator might notice that every major construction project in a particular area involved one of 3 companies, all of which had some tie back to him. Another might realize that bookmakers across the city were paying the same rate and dealing with the same intermediaries. Piece by piece, they mapped out how his network touched legitimate commerce. In the 1,980 seconds and early 1,990 seconds, union corruption formed a crucial part of that picture. Union locals that represented workers in building trades, trucking, and other fields could influence which companies received labor and at what cost. Controlling key figures within a local meant having a say in who worked where and under what conditions. Federal investigations later showed that his group placed trusted people in certain union roles, ensuring that if a contractor wanted a job to go smoothly, he would eventually find himself at a table with someone who had John's ear. The crimes in that arena were less visible than the highway shootings, but they had broader reach. Overcharging, no-show jobs, and padded contracts raised costs for entire projects, some of which involved public funds. Taxpayers ended up paying more so that a portion of the money could flow, quietly, into the pockets of men who never appeared on any official payroll. When he claimed, years later, that he had been only a businessman, prosecutors pointed back to these arrangements. They argued successfully that he had used his construction role not merely to build structures, but to help run an enterprise based on coercion and secret profit sharing. Looking at all this from a prison cell, he must have recognized pieces of himself in the government story, even if he rejected its version of events. He knew which of his choices had crossed into outright crime. Driving Bruno, he had watched earlier rackets operate. After his first conviction, he had the chance to step away. Instead, he resumed and expanded his role, eventually reaching the top of a family whose income depended largely on illegal activity. Those decisions, stacked over time, formed the backbone of the case that now held him in place. There were people who still argued in his favor. Some relatives and a few old associates claimed that the government had overstated his reach, that he had been a convenient symbol to crown a large case. They pointed out that organized crime in Philadelphia continued after his imprisonment, suggesting that the system was bigger than any one man. Others said the younger faction had been equally willing to engage in violence, and that it was unfair to pin the worst of the war only on his side. Courts, however, do not weigh reputations or balance sheets of blame in that way. They rule on specific charges. In his case, the jury had been persuaded beyond a reasonable doubt that he had taken part in an ongoing criminal enterprise, directed its finances, and authorized acts designed to keep it running. That legal conclusion defined him in official records far more than any private argument ever could. Over time, as new organized crime cases played out in cities across the country, his name turned up as a precedent. Lawyers cited his trial in motions about how much responsibility a boss bears for subordinates' acts. Judges referenced his appeals in written opinions about the scope of racketeering law. In that sense, he continued to shape the way courts dealt with mob leaders long after his own sentencing. Younger inmates who arrived in his prison sometimes recognized him from those legal materials or from documentaries. They would watch him line up for count or sit quietly with a book, and realize that this older man in khaki uniforms had once commanded fear on Philadelphia streets. For them, he was a living reminder that status outside means little once the gates close. His crimes: extortion, illegal gambling, misuse of unions, manipulation of construction contracts, conspiracies to harm rivals, and silence witnesses, had built a reputation that felt invincible at his peak. Each of those acts, though, left a trace. Piece by piece, those traces formed a chain that law enforcement finally used to lock him away. From that point on, whatever stories remained to tell about him belonged more to others than to him. Journalists, prosecutors, defense lawyers, former associates, and ordinary citizens caught in his orbit all carried fragments of what he had done. He chose, by and large, not to add to that record. Instead, He lived out his sentence in the structured quiet of federal custody, while the story of his crimes and their impact continued to be told without his voice. There were evenings when the common room television played the local news from Philadelphia, and his name floated across the screen again, attached not to his own trial this time, but to someone else's. New anchors, newer graphics, different haircuts, yet the story carried familiar shapes: arrests, racketeering charges, alleged bosses and underbosses. To the younger inmates half watching, it was just another case. To him, it looked like a replay with different actors. When Joey Merlino and several of his associates went on trial, reporters framed it as the saga of the new generation that had risen while he sat in a federal jail awaiting his own fate. Prosecutors described bookmaking, loans, and extortion, just as they had in his case. There were cooperators again, men who came into court and pointed to old friends across the room. The details differed, but the larger pattern confirmed something he had known since long before his arrest. This life had only a handful of endings, and none of them were good. In his unit, some inmates debated which side of the old war had been right, trading half-remembered stories from the papers. He stayed out of those conversations. It had been years since anyone on the outside took orders from him. The struggle for control of Philadelphia's rackets now belonged to others, and they were discovering what it felt like to have the full weight of federal attention on their backs. As those later trials unfolded, the FBI itself was changing. After the attacks of the 11th of September 2001, counterterrorism became the Bureau's top priority. Resources shifted, agents who once worked traditional organized crime squads were reassigned, and new technologies focused on different kinds of threats. But those changes did not undo the work already done against him and his contemporaries. By then, the major East Coast families had been hit with multiple waves of racketeering cases. Old leaders were in prison, some for life, others for decades. New recruits found themselves walking into a world where the risks were higher and the rewards increasingly uncertain. He watched that shift quietly. He had lived through an era when the mob could count on some measure of invisibility and informal protection. City politics, union relationships, and public reluctance to talk gave organizations like his breathing room. By the time he reached the federal system for the second and final time, that world was largely gone. Undercover operations had grown more sophisticated. Laws were sharper. Once an insider decided to cooperate, the government could map out years of crime in astonishing detail. Those who wrote about him in the 2000s and 2010 seconds tended to see him as a bridge figure. On one side stood the old-style bosses like Angelo Bruno, who prized calm and low visibility. On the other came the more flamboyant figures of the Scarfo and Merlino periods, whose violence and public swagger brought intense scrutiny. John's years as boss fell in between, an attempt by a conservative, Sicilian, rooted leader to bring order back, which instead ignited a final, damaging war. Documentaries and books that revisited the Philadelphia mob story devoted chapters to his tenure. Former agents sat under soft studio lights and explained how his construction company fit into their charts, how phone records tied him to men on both sides of the war, how wiretaps captured his allies talking in coded phrases. Cooperators recounted meetings where he spoke about loyalty, territory, and the need to straighten things out with rivals. Inside, he occasionally saw his own face appear briefly on a screen, maybe an old mugshot or a courtroom sketch, before the program cut to reenactments or expert commentary. If younger prisoners looked his way, he gave no reaction. Whatever story they told out there, in here he was an aging inmate with an ID card and a bunk like everyone else. The cost of his choices showed most clearly not on television but in his family. Visits grew harder as time went on. Relatives aged, moved, took new jobs, raised children. Travel meant days off work, money for gas or flights, and the emotional strain of walking into a prison, going through metal detectors, and sitting under watchful eyes while talking to a man who could not leave with them. For adults, the process was tiring. For children and grandchildren, it was confusing. He had left Sicily as a young man chasing opportunity. Decades later, some of his descendants were born American, with different accents, different prospects, and different expectations. They studied in schools where teachers talked openly about organized crime as a problem that had once been more powerful than it was now. They could search the internet and find his name attached to court decisions, news archives, and crime encyclopedias. For them, He was both a relative and a case study. Accounts from those who knew the family suggest that some of them did what many families of imprisoned figures in that world do. They kept a certain distance from his reputation, while still caring about him as a person. Children chose careers that had nothing to do with the street. Others tried to live quietly, hoping old associations would fade. The name Stanfa meant different things depending on where you heard it. In legal libraries, in South Philly social clubs, or in a schoolyard 2 states away. Beyond his personal circle, the Italian-American communities that had once provided recruiting ground for the mob took different trajectories. Many moved to suburbs, entered mainstream professions, and integrated more fully into broader American life. Being Italian no longer automatically meant living in close-knit city neighborhoods with visible mob presence. Younger generations formed identities less anchored in the old country codes of silence and neighborhood control. At the same time, Sicily itself changed. In the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, Italian magistrates led huge cases against Cosa Nostra, resulting in mass trials and long sentences. Brave prosecutors and judges paid with their lives for challenging mafia power. But in the long run, those sacrifices helped weaken the old structures. By the time he was serving life in the United States, the very homeland whose traditions had shaped him was undergoing its own painful reckoning with organized crime. Looking across those developments, law enforcement veterans sometimes used his life to illustrate how clinging to rigid old rules could not hold back larger forces. He had refused to talk in the Bruno investigation and had refused again after his own arrest. That loyalty to the code aligned with how bosses were expected to behave when he was young, yet the rules of the game around him shifted. Younger men flipped more quickly. Surveillance got better. Public patience with corruption grew thinner. In training lectures, agents would show timelines. Bruno's long, quiet reign, Testa's brief turn, Scarfo's bloody years, the power vacuum, John's rise, the war with the younger faction, then the nationwide crackdown. They pointed out that each internal conflict made the next federal case easier. Every feud produced frightened underlings, sloppier meetings, and eyewitnesses who might never have stepped forward in calmer times. His story became one more example in a broader lesson. Organized crime does not simply collapse under moral outrage. It erodes because its own members' choices provide the openings investigators need. As he aged into his late 60s and 70s, another layer of reality settled on him, the physical toll of long-term confinement. Medical issues that many men face as they grow older, heart problems, diabetes, joint pain, hit harder in prison, where diet, movement, and access to specialized care are limited. He spent more time in waiting rooms for prison doctors, more afternoons lying on an infirmary bed under fluorescent lights. The rhythm of his days slowed. Morning counts, once an interruption, became markers that divided time. A short walk in the yard on a good weather day felt significant. The noise of the television in the unit receded as his hearing dulled. His world, once stretched across 2 continents and multiple cities, now measured itself in yards and corridors. Occasionally, word reached him about the deaths of men he had known for decades. A former ally passed away in another federal facility. An old rival died in hospice care. Newspaper obituaries mentioned their participation in the same trials that had put him away. With each passing, another living link to the days of Bruno, Scarfo, and the war disappeared. Those losses underscored something simple but easy to ignore when men are young and ambitious. Time wins every contest. Power bases shift, cases fade from headlines, loyalties dissolve, and even the toughest reputations end in hospital charts and burial notices. If he thought about regret, no one outside his closest circle can say exactly what form it took. Some inmates nearing the end of their lives dwell on missed chances for a different path. Others cling to old justifications, insisting that circumstances left them no choice. A few simply accept that what's done is done. Those who observed him in custody described him as composed, rarely complaining, rarely confiding. Whatever reflections he had, he carried internally. Yet the objective lessons of his life are clear even without his commentary. The crimes that built his position, the loan sharking, gambling control, manipulation of unions and construction, orchestration of violence, brought fear and loss to many who never consented to be part of his world. Business owners changed how they ran their shops. Workers worried about crossing the wrong person. Families mourned loved ones caught in plots they did not start. In the end, the same activity that once gave him money and authority led directly to the courtroom where he heard the words, life imprisonment. The same internal war that was meant to secure his leadership helped produce the key witness whose testimony sealed his fate. The same code of silence that had once protected men like him could not withstand the combined pressure of grief, conscience, and decades in a cell offered to potential cooperators. For people listening to his story years later, especially at the edge of sleep, the arc has a certain stark clarity. A boy from a poor Sicilian town came to America with skills, ambition, and a willingness to work. He chose to attach those assets not only to lawful pursuits, but also to an underworld that promised faster gains and a different kind of respect. For a time, that choice gave him a role in events that would fill books and trials. Eventually, it took from him the one thing no money can buy back: freedom. By the time he reached his 80s, if you saw him shuffling down a prison corridor in soft-soled shoes, you might not immediately connect him with the heavily guarded defendant in old news footage or the tall, dark-haired driver in black and white photos next to Angelo Bruno's car. Age softens appearances, but it does not erase records. His Bureau of Prisons file, thick with reports and court documents, still told the same story it had on the day he arrived. Outside, Philadelphia continued to evolve. Neighborhoods that once housed social clubs linked to his world now featured new restaurants, renovated homes, and a different mix of residents. Some storefronts that had quietly hosted bookmaking operations turned into cafes where people typed on laptops. The city still had crime, but its patterns had shifted. The old-style mafia was no longer the central force it had been when he first stepped off the boat. Students walking down those streets today might pass places where he once collected envelopes or held low-voiced conversations and feel nothing unusual. The traces of his presence exist mostly in records now, in court rulings, in FBI files, in a line on an inmate locator saying, life. For a man whose younger years were spent in constant motion, the long stillness of that outcome is striking. The story of his rise, his crimes, his war, and his conviction winds through decades of American history. But his personal present is simple: a bed, a cell, fixed meal times, and an unwritten understanding that the gates will not open for him in this life. Yet even from that narrow space, his life continues to cast a long shadow, because it holds within it questions that do not age. How far people will go for power, what loyalty really means when tested, and whether any amount of status can compensate for the loss of ordinary mornings spent walking free. By the time he moved into his 80s, days in prison blended into one another so smoothly that only small details set them apart. A new guard on the tier, a different cereal at breakfast, a headline in an old newspaper clipped and passed along from another unit. Years that once would have been marked by big events, weddings, business deals, meetings in back rooms now passed with almost no outward sign. In the early mornings, when count cleared and the doors clicked open, he sometimes stood at the narrow window and watched the sky shift color over the fences. The yard, the towers, the distant hills or buildings beyond the walls changed with the seasons, but his vantage point did not. For a man who had once driven constantly through Philadelphia, cruising past row houses, bridges, waterfronts, and construction sites, the fixed view carried its own quiet punishment. People often imagine that a man in his position spends his last decades replaying one scene the night Bruno died: the bullets on the highway, the judge reading life. Those moments certainly stand out in any account of his life. But his story is bigger than single shocks. It is the slow buildup of choices, small and large, that turned a Sicilian mason into the boss of the Philadelphia mob and then into a permanent resident of the federal system. He came from a place where hard work and silence were basic survival skills. In Sicilian, those who did not talk too much lived longer. When he reached America, those same traits helped him rise. He kept his head down on job sites, took orders without complaint, and watched everything. As Bruno's driver, he learned how power flowed behind the facade of normal city life. Later, as a business owner and organizer, he learned how to bend legitimate structures, companies, unions, contracts, so that hidden hands took a cut. None of that was inevitable. Many Sicilian immigrants landed in Philadelphia, New York, or Chicago, and spent their lives running bakeries, laying bricks, or driving trucks without ever taking the step into organized crime. The world he entered was a choice, even if it felt at times like the natural extension of what he had seen around him. Once he committed, though, the logic of that world held him tight. Loyalty was rewarded. Obedience was valued. Doubt was punished. Law enforcement pieced together that logic through decades of surveillance, informant statements, and financial records. Agents studying his case learned that the same man who discussed union contracts could, in a different room, talk about disciplining a bookmaker or dealing with a suspected traitor. They saw how he switched smoothly between roles. Businessman, mediator, enforcer by proxy. The people on the receiving end of his decisions rarely saw the whole figure. A contractor might see only a calm man suggesting that it would be better for everyone if a certain firm got the job. A gambler in trouble might see only the collector demanding payment. A union member might see only the colleague urging a particular vote. Behind those encounters, though, sat the same organizing mind. Even in his absence, the traces remained. Court records showed how his construction company interacted with public projects. Labor hearings revealed how certain locals had fallen under quiet influence. RICO indictments detailed how monthly envelopes from gambling and loans made their way up the chain. The Bruno grand jury transcripts showed his refusal to talk after the boss's assassination. The later racketeering trial transcripts showed his name linked to a network of men who carried guns, placed bombs, or scouted rivals. Because he stayed mostly silent after his conviction, others ended up defining him. Prosecutors framed him as the architect of a criminal enterprise. Defense attorneys painted him as a businessman demonized for old associations. Journalists described him as an old-school Sicilian, clashing with flashy street kids. Cooperating former associates cast him as both mentor and taskmaster, someone who could be generous one day and unyielding the next. In truth, all of those angles catch some part of him. A man can be deeply devoted to family and faith, and still choose to run a system built on fear. He can sit in church on Sunday and send debt collectors out on Monday. He can tell a young relative to work hard in school and tell a young soldier to handle a problem the same week. His life shows how easily people can divide themselves into compartments, convincing themselves that what they do in one role does not cancel what they value in another. From a distance, the easiest part of his story to understand is the ending. A life sentence in federal prison is clear. There is no guesswork. Once appeals are done, what remains harder to grasp is what that means in the day-to-day. For him, it meant the loss of all casual movement. No unplanned drives through the city. No visits to old friends in South Philadelphia cafes. No last-minute trips back to Sicily to see the streets where he grew up. Every movement now requires permission. To go from his unit to the chapel, he waits until staff open the doors and call the list. To see a doctor, he signs up and waits. To make a phone call, he signs in, watches the clock, and knows that every word can be monitored. The independence he once enjoyed even in the illegal world has been replaced by strict schedules. As an older inmate, he occupies a strange place in the prison social order. Young men with long sentences sometimes approach him for stories, hoping to hear colorful tales of mob life. By most accounts, he gives them little. He might nod, offer a few general comments, then turn the conversation elsewhere. Whatever legends swirl around him among the inmates are fed more by what others say than by his own mouth. In another sense, he has become a living archive for people who study organized crime. Scholars of criminology, writers, and agents in training look at his case and see a turning point. The Philadelphia family emerged from the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds as a powerful regional force. Bruno's murder shattered its balance. Scarfo's regime brought wild brutality. John's rise and the war with the younger faction marked the last full-scale struggle before law enforcement and internal betrayals knocked the organization down to a fraction of its former strength. The tactics used to convict him: long-term surveillance, undercover recordings, exploitation of internal stress became standard tools for later cases. His name surfaces in legal discussions about how much responsibility a leader bears for actions carried out by those below him. Future bosses in other cities, reading about his fate, could see how little protection a low-profile, and a legitimate business front offered once the government decided to press a case. For communities that lived under his shadow, the impact lasted longer than the headlines. Some small businesses took years to recover from the cost of extortion payments. Workers in certain trades remained wary of union politics, remembering how easily democratic processes had been bent by hidden pressure. Families who lost relatives to the war carried that grief forward, whether or not they ever spoke publicly about it. When people ask whether he ever expressed remorse, the honest answer is that nothing public and explicit is on record. In private conversations with family or a prison chaplain, something else might have surfaced, but those moments belong to those present. From the outside, we see only that he did not make dramatic apologies in court, did not grant interviews confessing to specific misdeeds, and did not trade information for leniency. That stance can be read in different ways. To some, it looks like stubborn pride or denial. To others steeped in the old code, it looks like loyalty to a way of life, held even when it no longer offers practical benefit. In either case, the consequence remains unchanged. Silence did not save his freedom. It only fixed his story more firmly in place. A man who entered the life fully and accepted its ultimate price. As of the last public records, he remains in federal custody, serving his life term. No parole date is posted next to his name. The only change that will come is the one that comes for everyone. Age, and, eventually, the end of his natural life. When that day arrives, it will likely pass quietly, noted in a Bureau of Prisons record. Perhaps a brief line in a newspaper, or an update in a crime encyclopedia. By then, almost everyone who knew him in his prime will be gone, or very old. New waves of crime will occupy public attention. Different surnames will appear in indictments and on television. The stations that once sent cameras to his trial will be covering other stories. Yet the pattern his life followed: early struggle, rise through a criminal network, a period of power, then a long fall into custody, will still be playing out in other forms, in other places. For listeners hearing his story at night, there is a certain quiet in that realization. The extremes of his life can make him seem distant, almost like a character from another era. But underneath the layers of mob lore and legal history lies something very human. The way one decision builds on another. The way ambition and fear and loyalty can lead a person further than they ever meant to go. He began as a boy carrying stones in a Sicilian town, learning to build walls that would last. He crossed an ocean, carried bricks on American job sites, and built houses, offices, and churches that still stand. At the same time, he helped build another kind of structure, an organization held together by allegiance, money, and intimidation. That second structure crumbled under pressure from within and from the law, and when it fell, it took him down with it. The buildings he raised in Philadelphia may outlast his memory. People will live, work, and worship inside spaces his crews helped construct, without knowing the path their builder walked. In that way, he leaves behind something tangible beyond the court cases and the headlines. But the more important legacy may be invisible, a lesson written into legal codes, police training, and community awareness that shows how deeply organized crime can infiltrate ordinary systems and how much effort it takes to root it out. On certain nights, when count is done and the unit lights dim, he lies on his bunk and closes his eyes. Outside, somewhere far beyond the fences, South Philadelphia streets are still alive with voices, traffic, and late-night diners. Farther away, the sea brushes Sicily's shores, as it did when he was a child. Those sounds do not reach his cell. Instead, he hears the familiar noises of the institution. Distant doors, muted televisions, the low murmur of other men talking themselves to sleep. Whatever he remembers in those moments is known only to him. He might see himself behind the wheel of Bruno's car, or walking a construction site with blueprints under his arm, or sitting in a federal courtroom as a jury files back in. He might think of family members gathered around holiday tables, of old friends in neighborhood cafes, of faces long gone. Memory has no bars, but it cannot unlock doors either. What is certain is that when morning comes, the routine will begin again. The same counts, the same doors, the same sky beyond the wire. His story, with all its twists from Sicilian to South Philadelphia, from backroom meetings to televised trials, has already reached its final chapter. The remaining pages are filled with repetition, not drama. For those hearing it now, Drifting towards sleep, the tale of John Stanfa settles into a simple truth that cuts through all the complexity. Power built on fear, however strong it seems in the moment, does not hold. It collapses under its own weight, under the patience of the law, under the quiet courage of those who decide to speak. In the end, every choice leaves a mark. His left many on streets, in families, in law books, and behind one heavy door that closes each night on an old man who once walked those streets as if they belonged to him. And with that, we bring tonight's chapter of the Silent Empires to a close. John Stanfa here, thanking you for walking with me through the tension, the strategy, and the quiet battles that shaped my path in Philadelphia's underworld. If this story helped you unwind or drift towards sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and stay tuned for more tales of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the stillness of the night wrap around you, and may the echoes of history guide you gently into rest. Good night.